The following podcast contains mature language and spoilers. Listener discretion is advised. If I remember correctly, they didn't have Beast Boy around for the New 52 Teen Titans, at least not initially. They reserved him for this team called the Ravagers, which was them doing essentially Titans West. There's always been that drive to have a second Titans title, even though they never really had the crew to support something like that. And so they're constantly throwing out these satellite titles that don't end up working out. And this was the latest. And the way they were trying to make the Ravagers work was to bring in a bunch of Gen 13 stuff. And so you basically have a mashup of Teen Titans and Gen 13. And I guess they probably had some other Wildstorm type stuff in there as well. I don't remember a lot of the specifics. I think Tom DeFalco wrote it, and I believe initially Ian Churchill drew it. And for some reason, they decided to make Beast Boy red. And I believe that was because they wanted to tie him into the red from Swamp Thing materials, where you've got the green, which is flora. So I guess they needed the red to be fauna, and they wanted to associate with that or something. Or maybe they just thought that the character would come across cooler red. It was like in a violent, extreme type book. They've got an imagey artist drawing it. So that's kind of the goal. Nobody liked that book. It was tied into all the murder, death, kill stuff that was going on in Teen Titans stuff when Lobdell was doing it. And then a little while later, they got another writer, if I remember correctly, and I think Kenneth Rocafort did a new Teen Titans series where they basically put the characters that people like from the Johns McCone series back together again and tried to pretend that other stuff didn't happen. But, you know, me doing my little project, I leaned heavily on Scott Lobdell's reviled New 52 runs, and all that harvest culling content fed into the bloodlust of my own project. Beast Boy got his own fake title that was steeped in that material. Plus, I added a new character by the name of Changeling, who was Vixen's cousin by the uncle who'd murdered her parents in the Bronze Age. If I recall correctly, Lobdell's metahuman teenagers killing each other in secret bases included an African locale, so Changeling and Beast Boy would both end up in that battle royale. I think I was running Teen Titans Go as background noise at the time, and I got drawn into its wacky lore, which informed my views of Beast Boy and Cyborg in their individual books. Through Beast Boy, I got to touch on mothballed properties like The Movement, a brief New 52 series by Gail Simone and Freddie Williams II about homeless teen metahumans. The Changeling feature was mostly a dumping ground where I could kill teenage metahumans from books like The Movement and The Ravagers, plus the Gen 13 adjacent like DV8. The Beast Boy book ended with a flash forward to the future depicted in Scott Lobdell's run of New 52 Teen Titans, where they were among the only surviving members when confronted by the killer future Superboy, Jonathan Lane Kent. I never had a feel for the Jaime Reyes Blue Beetle. To me, he fell into the Kyle Rayner camp of Peter Parker plus everyman characters that have greatness plopped in their unworthy laps. However, I was not going to engage in a Latino erasure, especially in 2020, when I thought the US immigration policy couldn't get any worse, so I was stuck with it. So my first idea was to have the Scarab stolen from Jaime by an alternate Earth Ted Kord, and then have Jaime have to earn the title without powers. I also wanted him more integrated into the sphere of Charlton characters, who would help the non-powered teenager on his quest. Going after the alternate Ted Kord gave Booster Gold a reason to hang out with Jaime, while I also explored the very different Charlton version of Captain Atom, who was also tied to the future version of Captain Adam, ADYM or some such, that was in the New 52 Legion future. Because I was increasingly leaning on both politics and the multiverse, I'd have Jaime's parents facing ICE as undocumented migrants from another dimension. Also, Jaime's sci-fi scarab tied into an alien race called the Reach, so I figured to drag him into all the space stuff I was doing with the Vegan star system eventually. During the New 52, someone had the profoundly stupid idea of rebooting the blue and the gold duo of Blue Beetle and Booster Gold into the black and the blue, teaming Black Lightning and Blue Devil. Hawkman and the Atom were Justice League teammates that couldn't carry their own individual titles, so they were conjoined. It didn't work commercially, but the characters were bonded in fans' minds forevermore. The same thing was tried with Power Man and Iron Fist, which worked commercially and creatively by using the characters' personal, racial, and class differences to drive better stories than they enjoyed individually. Neither Jefferson Pierce nor Dan Cassidy had held solo titles in decades, and in no way worked together in a story, so that was a flop concept that was mostly forgotten just a few years on. However, Brett Booth redesigned the characters for that project, and one of his unused concepts was the closest to the original Blue Devil costume since Underworld Unleashed, so I used it to introduce my own take on the character. Santiago Santi Ramirez was basically a mashup of Bruce Campbell and Robert Rodriguez, an independent filmmaker used to making do in every capacity of no-budget slashers. He figuratively sells his soul to the scandal-plagued Werner Brothers studio to finally have the resources to make a superhero blockbuster. But it's the cursed reboot of the Blue Devil franchise. So cursed, in fact, that he has to use a Blue Devil suit that's actually the flayed skin of the demonically enchanted Dan Cassidy. That dark wrinkle aside, the fake book was basically a chance for me to do the same kind of Holly weird stories as the 80s book that I loved so much that I co-host an occasional podcast on it with the Idiotable Shag. Also, like the old book, it was a repository for kooky Silver Age, mostly Flash villains in any given edition of Who's Who they were meant to draw from. Those Blue Devil synopses were my single favorite part of the Who's Editing project. Its fun and relative innocence is the reason why I canceled the book at number 10, because I didn't want to take that title to the dark places the project was planned to go next. In case I didn't mention it before, I used this project and its killing off of the Justice League to strand Black Canary on the New 52 version of Earth 2. It gave me another excuse to explore the multiverse and the weird parallel Earth where Darkseid's forces had killed Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman before briefly occupying the planet. Since Who's Who was still steeped in the pre-crisis multiverse, it gave me a place to put the Golden Age heroes when they turned up, and where the New 52 hadn't put a modern twist on them, I would. I also put my transgendered heroine Breathtaker there. Since I'd stuck Dinah on Earth 2, I could still make a claim for Cyborg, the Last Leaguer, as a book. In the quasi-zombie comic Deceased, spelled with a DC at the 4, Cyborg was the patient zero of a 28 days later type rage virus that carried back from Apocalypse in his artificial body. Deceased was better than it had a right to be, thanks to having Tom Taylor at the helm, but that weight of guilt being placed on Victor Stone didn't sit well with me. To change it up, I had Vic instead fall victim to the exaltation rubric, Highfather's version of the anti-life equation that enslaved the will with a joyous religious zeal, was basically the same poison. The life equations had been introduced during John Ostrander's Martian Manhunter run, and combined with the lasso of truth, had freed Cyborg before the JLA's final, fatal battle on New Genesis. Since the rubric was infecting people in part through mother boxes, Cyborg destroyed them all using the matricide gambit, yet another bullshit virus I came up with. That closed all the boom tubes, sealing off the fourth world, and casting the Justice League that were still in a boom tube to an unknown fate. There's also like a legion of New Genesians who were under the thrall of Highfather coming through the window and all this shit, so yeah, they got fucked too. Months later, Victor Stone had recovered, but he's been changed by the touch of cosmic forces. He's in an upgraded armor using alien technology, and he has to rebuild Earth's defenses against retaliation and invasion. I still have a largely different idea in my back pocket for how to help Cyborg reach legitimate A-list superhero status if I ever got the opportunity, but under the Who's Editing scheme, I figured this would also work. Another area where I wanted to build Cyborg up was to make him the central figure among Black DC heroes. My first plan had been to use a new Crisis to properly fold Wildstorm and Milestone into a single DC continuity. That plan changed, so I went from excluding any reference to those companies to making as many references to them as I could. These intersecting purposes meant that by the end of my Who's Editing efforts, Cyborg was essentially forming an all-African replacement Justice League. Rivals like the Star Squadron had fallen as Earth was entering its apocalyptic phase, and Cyborg would have led one of a few such leagues. His was to include Mr. Terrific, Hardware, Black Lightning, the Shiloh Norman Mr. Miracle, the Manhattan Guardian, Vixen, probably Technique, and maybe Icon. But I had that last guy tied up in another project I'll get to later on. One of those alternate incarnations was Justice League Extreme, made up of all the Chromium Age replacements of the Magnificent Seven. They included Bloodwind, Artemis, the near-future Walter West Dark Flash, Aquaman's bastard son Koryak as Aquamaster, the reborn Jean-Paul Valley from Doomsday Clock as Nightfall, Kyle Rayner with a white-powered battery as the Omega Lantern, and a mashup of Superman alternates forming Rain Man, R-E-I-G-N, Reign of Superman Man. We were still deep in the pandemic in 2021, so I couldn't get any commissions done, but I liked this idea well enough to get it as digital art from Brad Green. That turned out great, but I only had 3 fake issues of Runway with the concept, which I spent on setting up a 21st Century League of Super Assassins. More on that later. Related, I took a one-time blurb from a Triangulate cover and made up Strike Force Superman. I needed heroes to defend Metropolis in the Man of Steel's absence, and had fun with abandoned characters. The Contessa was trying to take over, using her resources from Project Cadmus, and so she recruited a team that included the African-American Guardian seen briefly in New 52 Superboy comics. This was not the same Metropolis Guardian from the Cyborg book, but rather the police detective Mike Henderson from Triangle Era Superman comics. who would be killed by the evil Superboy before Cyborg forms his team. Actually, let me step back a moment. Nightwing seemed pretty lost in the New 52, especially as he spent a lot of time disconnected from Batman. After Forever Evil, he was presumed dead and became a covert operative of an espionage agency called Spiral. I kept most of that from my story, but made a big pivot to have Nightwing move to Metropolis to contain the ambitions of Lex Luthor. I think he used the Wayne fortune to buy the Daily Planet, maybe turn it into the TV network or something, and he used that as part of his crusade against Luthor. That setup crossed over with Strike Force Superman, and I also wanted to play with story ideas I had for decades that will never play out in the actual comics. For instance, a future version of Dick Grayson from that distant time of 2001, Armageddon, naturally, used to lead the Teen Titans. He traveled back to the 90s, where he became possessed by Trigon and conceived a baby with the teenage superheroine Mirage. Now, I had one correction for this by revealing that the future version of Nightwing was actually a resurrected Jason Todd, but then Beneath the Red Hood took the option off the table. So I went back to it being evil future Dick Grayson. That meant that our Dick was the biological father of Mirage's baby, and the state was finally coming after him for support payments. So the plan was to bring Mirage into the series and have Dick adjust to being a father. I was going to say without the fun part, but he actually did fuck Mirage during a period when she impersonated Starfire, and that was actually what busted up the longtime couple. I honestly have more affection for Mirage, and maybe Dick would too eventually. Not so fast though, since I also had Dick turning up in that Batgirls book I was doing, with the one that replaced Birds of Prey, and he was rekindling the spark of romance he had with his one true pairing in my book, Barbara Gordon. But then I canceled that book after 6 issues and saddled Nightwing with Flamebird as the new partner. Another complication. Actually, I did end up going back and having Red Hood be the baby daddy after all, because I wanted to tie in with Monarch and the various incarnations of Captain Atom as part of my grand Legion scheme, not to mention the big Legion Titans crossover. And on top of that, I even braved the New 52 Future's End and involved poor Terry McGinnis, aka Batman Beyond. See, Jason had ties to the Assassin's Guild in the New 52, which brought him into the Gotham City stuff that I was doing, but also again the Legion stuff. I know I haven't told you about the Legion stuff yet. We're getting there. I've hinted at it. Anyway, as convoluted as this soap opera got, you can see why I took my sweet time explaining it all in podcast form. Oh, and there was a new Birds of Prey involved that I put together from other New 52 cast-offs like Bluebird, Robina, Starling, Rico or Ico, and Tracy 13. The weeds so deep. A pet project of mine from long before Siskoid started Who's Editing was a DC Comics series set in the 1950s. It drives me nuts that every trace of superhuman activity just vanishes after the Justice Society's forced retirement during McCarthyism. It's such a nativist notion to think that just because superheroes are more or less outlawed in the United States, that nobody would have them until we okayed it again. That's why I love concepts like the Dome and the Global Guardians. But also, they outlawed booze by constitutional amendment, but people still drank. It put me in mind of Project Paperclip, where former Nazi scientists were repatriated and concealed by the US government so they could work on the space race and the Manhattan Project for us. Surely they would see having some mystery men in plain clothes on the payroll as an asset. A military industrialist type like Commander Steele, the Indestructible Man, would surely be willing to go back to being Hank Haywood and bully others into serving their country or shutting down entirely. I paired him up first with period spy King Faraday, then added the young all-star Iron Monroe, Crime Spasher, and Americommando to this covert proto-men in black. I'd never named them before and wanted to avoid the usual Society League terms, ended up simply calling them the Club. That term doesn't get nearly as much play with comic book groups, and I liked how it complemented their role as a cudgel to keep costume crime in the closet. Later on, I got other cynical 20th century babies like Jenny Sparks, Elijah Snow, Jacob Marlowe, and from the Watchmen, the Minutemen into the mix, and used it to lead into my fake maxi series, Atomic and Conquest of the Barren Earth. I have a mild nostalgia for the Creeper, since it was an early comic exposure for me, but I don't know what to do with him any more than anyone else does. In the New 52, they made the Creeper some sort of Japanese Oni demon, which didn't take. I married the Oni to the original right-wing pundit Jack Ryder, causing him to go full Alex Jones. Beyond parodying conservative politics, mingling him with other Steve Ditko-esque objectivist types, like the Doomsday Clock version of Rorschach, and also having him get involved in crossovers, there wasn't much to this, and it was among my least loved attempts. Back to Strike Force Superman, I had the other Nightwing, Chris Kent, aka Lord Zod, on the team as Phantom Lad. Other members were Apollo from the Authority and the short-lived Lana Lang Superwoman. In a bit of a cheat, I reclaimed Peter David's creator-owned character Fallen Angel, which he initially strongly hinted was the Linda Danvers version of Supergirl that had broken bad on the supernatural tip. I was a big fan of the first 50 issues of the Earth Angel Supergirl, but Fallen Angel didn't grab me, so I grabbed the IP instead. The most important member, though, was Jonathan Lane Kent, the murderous News 52 Superboy that had been raised by Harvest several centuries in the future, which would tie into one of the key meta-narratives of this project. Besides killing off the Guardian, this Superboy, called the Superboy, also iced the Eradicator, which led to his remains being used in Rain Man, member of Justice League Extreme. It all folds in. Again, stuff like Future's End started making its way into Strike Force Superman, and I revealed that this Lana Lang was actually from the same Earth Zero as the New 52 Superman, who was killed off just prior to DC Rebirth. That Superman was replaced by one from a Convergence timeline that continued the pre-Flashpoint continuity, which continued in the series Superman, Lois, and Clark. That had the couple raising a son on the Kent farm, a clear influence on the CW TV show Superman and Lois. In comics, their only son was Jonathan Samuel Kent, who eventually became the DC Rebirth Superboy and formed a duo with the Damian Wayne Robin as the modern Super Sons. In my continuity, this John Kent stayed about 11 years old, instead of being rapid grown to late teens by that idiot Brian Michael Bendis. I had featured this nascent Superboy and his widowed mom in a late arriving book titled Action Comics Family. I really wanted to get the original DC titles back into play, so I continued their numbering too. Before that though, I did a little dance to keep those developments in the core continuity. So our Superman never regained his powers after Infinite Crisis, but was instead replaced by the Earth Zero Superman, who along with his Earth's Lana Lang, was working with one of the big space-time players. There was still a time jump for John Kent to make up the difference, but he remained a preteen. This all led into Future's End, again, where it turned out that the New 52 Superman was actually an adult version of one of the current day Superboys. I think the murderous Jonathan Lane Kent. Meanwhile, future Lana Lang was in the present to deal with Susan Lang, her nigh omnipotent adoptive daughter from Future's End. Also known as 50 Sue, she was a creation of Project Cadmus that got out of control. I know this is a super convoluted knot of forsaken New 52 continuity and fan fiction, which is why I drink and drag out the explanation of this abandoned project. Oh, and just to completely fuck things up, I also had all of those Future's End characters make a pit stop in the Infinite Crisis pocket dimension where Earth 2 Superman and Lois and Alexander Luthor lived, and Superboy Prime, because Superboy Prime's gonna get into this shit. Just you wait. Oh, and for the record, fellow Super Son Damian Wayne took over Detective Comics, and Robin took on the Midnighter as a new partner against the various warring factions of the League of Assassins. I never had any use for Damian Wayne. He's just too much of a little shit for me. I get why he exists. I'm not trying to say kill him off, although they've certainly tried a few times. I guess he was just too popular. I just don't want to interact with him very much, and so I didn't have a lot of use for him in the project. Mostly his fake book was a place for me to put Gotham City bullshit, and also I kept leading into all the assassin stuff, which of course ties in the Ra's al Ghul and Talia al Ghul, Pappy and Mammy, and all that assassin stuff was going to tie into the bigger picture, since I was going to have Osensei be at this point in history as time was being seeded with these assassins. As the Who's Editing project evolved, I became increasingly fixated on tying together everything into one narrative. Earlier on, though, I'd just run with an elevator pitch. For instance, Balloon Buster was some cowboy from World War I that flew a propeller plane to blow up enemy observation balloons. I guess you could update that to drones or some shit, but who gives a fuck about it yet? Plus, you still had to work with the name, so I took it euphemistically. I turned it into a young adult graphic novel about a Jane Lane type trans girl who's a sarcastic ball buster. The dumbass old character was named Steve Savage, so I borrowed from Scandal Savage to have my gal justify her existence to her literal caveman transphobe ancestor Vandal Savage. Some other old-timey bullshit was Captain Compass, about a post-war naval detective. I'd read somewhere that when people die at sea and decompose, their shoes act as a flotation device, and the relatively weak tendons at the ankle tend to break free of the rest of the body. So shoe soles tend to carry the feet back to shore, where they wash up poop on beaches. The sea is grim and unforgiving, so I figured, why not have this detective deal with all the fucked up shit that happens in international waters, often involving some extrajudicial methods. I called it the Mortal Compass, a play on moral compass, and used Corto Maltese fan art to give it a European album vibe. Another boat jockey was Captain Storm, the skipper of a WWIIPT boat. Captain Storm actually came back in a DC Rebirth Superman title and that Bug miniseries Mike Allred did, and I eventually worked up some of that bullshit into the overarching story. But at first I did another YA graphic novel called Storm Captain, about an orphaned Russian girl who struggles with her identity as an adoptee through substance abuse and mental health issues by channeling her demons into a regatta. I took a few surface elements from a girl I went to school with. A comedy graphic novel was Peter Bag's Bug-Eyed Bandit, about a toxic nerd who became a pariah when his attempt to steal a copy of Showcase number 4 from an ailing shop makes him a comic community pariah. I confess that this take was informed by my own years as a retailer, and I merged several of my former customers into a composite. I never had much use for Brian Azzarello, so I pretended he gave Dr. Occult a hard-boiled Mickey Spillane makeover in I, the Occult. I always dug the character of Bronze Tiger because, he's Black Belt Jones with a cool cat-themed costume. The New 52 fucked that up royally by making him like a werewolf and shit. Dumb as shit. Didn't go anywhere, thankfully. And so I wanted to take the opportunity to make him a badass human martial artist in this project again. And I integrated him into the Gotham City stuff that I was doing. But the problem was that he didn't have enough of his own lore. And so I was able to work the spy angle by having him go up against his former employers in Good, Good. I don't remember what the acronym stands for. But most of his best bits were stolen by the White Canary character, the sister of Black Canary, within the Gotham City storyline. So I felt bad that I didn't get to do nearly as much with Bronze Tiger as I would have liked. But regardless, it was still better than that garbage that they did in the New 52. As an aside to the Bronze Tiger stuff too, they also had a New 52 Richard Dragon, who was introduced in Green Arrow Volume 5, number 23. And basically they do this whole thing where Richard Dragon is actually Ricardo Diaz Jr., who I think killed and replaced the original Richard Dragon because he was a more badass martial artist. And they had him tied in with all this Green Arrow legal assassins type shit. And it's just one of those deals where it's like, why do you even bother to use the name? You want this to be a Latino character. You still want to have sort of a nod to the old Richard Dragon, but you want to have this new guy running around as a big villain. Just come with a new character. Jesus Christ. I've talked before about how Convergence was clearly supposed to be this really big event that was going to herald the return, or at least the DC rebirth, if not the return of the pre-Flashpoint DC universe. And of course, they had really nice artists on this and such. But of course, it was quite the wet fart. Nobody cared by this point. But it's especially interesting when you take into account that Mike Grell had created the Warlord character back in the 1970s. And it was one of the biggest hits that DC had in that time period, helped to keep the company afloat. And Grell was involved with the series for many years before he left it behind, and other people worked on it. Michael Fleischer, I think, wrote a lot of that stuff, and Dan Jurgens did a lot of the artwork. Grell didn't have anything to do with the character for a long time after the series, but he came back in the early 2000s to do a few more Warlock miniseries. I think he did one with Andy Smith or Bart Sears, kind of interchangeable sometimes, right? And I think he did some of the stuff himself as well. I think he did the last issue himself. And basically, he completed the cycle that he'd started with Warlord, where he had conceived a child who was lost to him. He was stolen by Deimos and believed dead and raised on the streets and all this stuff. And eventually this red-haired kid grows up and becomes a new warlord when Mike Grell finally kills off Travis Morgan. And of course, Deimos had been killed a bunch of times over the course of the series, but he's a villain. Villains come back, no big deal. So for Convergence, they decided to bring everybody back. Warlord and his wife, whose name escapes me right now, and Deimos. And Deimos was one of the big bads. The biggest bad was Brainiac, because some future version of Brainiac had come back to fuck with the various realities and pit them against one another, although, Monarch had something to do with that shit as well, I think. And Jesus, it's just a convoluted fucking mess. But Deimos had partnered up with Brainiac, and so he was controlling a bunch of stuff from his lair in Skartaris and stuff. And he was kind of supposed to be the big bad of the miniseries, at least. And one of the casualties of the miniseries is Travis Morgan, who'd already been killed 10 years earlier. And they bring him back in this series just to kill him off again, just so they can add to the body count. And of course, I like Deimos, and I knew Deimos because I had the old Warlord Rimco action figure, and I'd read some of the Warlord comic books back in the day. But bringing this fucker back in 2016 and trying to make him one of the big face villains of this event with no setup was just Looney Tunes. It was the fucking hubris of that. God damn. I want to take a moment to address the New 52 Dr. Psycho. And Dr. Psycho is one of my favorite Wonder Woman villains, but they were just doing dumb shit throughout the New 52. And one of the things they did was they reintroduced the New 52 Dr. Psycho in Superboy Volume 6, number 18 in 2013. And he was still a little person, but for some reason they had him have a headscarf and a facial scarf where he looked like he was Middle Eastern or something, but they never did anything with that. And I don't know why they did that in the first place. And so they had him getting involved with the Jonathan Lane Kent version of Superboy and like whatever that project he was working with, Hive, which of course was also being borrowed from Teen Titans, but they had Superboy closely tied in with the New 52 Titans, so it's not as big of a deal for them to be doing stuff with Hive. But they've also got Dr. Psycho as sort of a frenemy of his in that book, if I remember correctly. And it's like one of the reasons why he's such a great Wonder Woman villain is because he's a misogynist and he does lousy stuff to women, and he's literally a small man with a small mind and inappropriate views of women, and that's reflected by his appearance and his power set. The whole point of this guy is he is a representation of misogyny. So why would you have him fight Superboy? I had a fascination with the Omega Men in large part because they were elusive. They had that wicked name that I didn't know was a lift from a Chuck Heston movie. These really uninformative blurbs in the DC samplers and fucking sick house ad art from Keith Giffen that got turned into a postcard that I pestered a camp counselor to give me. I was still impoverished, but our school had some deal where you could go to camp as a sampler for low to no cost. I remember it being a week, but I have a hard time believing that I would have spent that long in a strange wooden bunk in a room with a dozen other dudes and come away without more memories. Plus, I was still in school. So I probably bugged this dude for his postcard over a weekend. He gave it up, and I promptly lost the goddamn thing. Anyway, calling a team the Omega Men is badass, and it was notoriously violent for its time. But nobody actually liked the fucking thing. I read the core story arc for this project, and yeah, it's your basic Star Wars retread, but without a single character being as memorable or charismatic as fucking Lobot. Also, furries for no good reason. But I worked a bunch of these shits into various fake books since I'd read up on them. I had the Babe title going with the big childlike Atari Force member, so I dropped him on Earth to contrast his innocence against the heinousness of the U.S. immigration system of the first Trump term. I fucking hated ICE, and that was years before they went full-on secret police Nazi cunts that should have their own Nuremberg someday. Because Babe isn't that interesting, I paired him with the Omegan Brute, in homage to Bart Sears' Wizard magazine art tutorial column. So Brute and Babe end up in Ace custody, alien containment enforcement, and those Gestapo pigs were a background threat to any extraterrestrials on Earth that I had in the line of fake books. But just sprinkling Omegans all over wasn't enough for me. You can't do a DC title with Omega in it without thinking about the Omega effect and the new gods in general. I decided to connect the two, especially since there were visual similarities thanks to Giffen's Kirby influence. I wanted to subvert the paradigm of a good Moses-type Sky Daddy and the High Father and the god of fascism that is Darkseid. High Father already had a questionable relationship with a young boy in the 70s revival, and every creative team since Kirby had tried to give the Fourth World Saga more estrogen to work with. There was a relatively recent Female Furies miniseries that I skimmed that went hard on the misogyny on Apocalypse, but I also wanted to me too the patriarchy on New Genesis. High Father had already done plenty of questionable shit in the canon, so there's already a lot of material just below the surface to make you question how one sustains a seeming paradise. One of the angles was that the Vega system was essentially the new god's third world, where they intentionally pit factions against one another in eternal war while they extracted resources. The events of the fake Apocalypse maxi series had cut off the Fourth World from virtually every place else, causing a collapse of New Genesis and an Airspring type reevaluation of the Vegan system's place in the interstellar hierarchy. I vaguely remembered a subplot in the Infinity Man book that Didio and Giffen did, where Big Bear was either plotting or fated to kill High Father. So I shipped him back to his home on Apocalypse, which may also be specific to the New 52. I used a bunch of images of a battalion from Teen Titans to evolve Big Bear into Red Bear, a militant revolutionary trying to survive Apocalypse long enough to reunite with his beloved beautiful dreamer on New Genesis. I didn't reference Orion much, but my idea was that ultimately nature wins out over nurture, and he's driven a bit mad over the ongoing revelations about his flawed father figure, High Father. So he's MIA, while the various elites of Apocalypse work to consolidate power, all with the oversight of the semi-collapsed New Genesis. That's actually part of the reason Red Bear is allowed to live, as a potential resource for one of the elites once he becomes too violently disillusioned with the two-party system of fascist Apocalypse and exploitive patriarchy New Genesis. The idea is realized that Orion would eventually return to guide Apocalypse towards his own flawed, moralist authoritarianism, where Red Bear would join him once it becomes clear there would be no reunion with Dreamer. I never decided for sure whether Mr. Miracle was dead or would escape the Grim Reaper again, but the goal was to sideline most of the male heroic figures of the Fourth World saga to elevate the heroines. Big Barda would essentially replace Orion as the central hero of the saga, as she would struggle with her dark origins on Apocalypse and would be guided to the light by love and a thirst for freedom. She'd be the military might behind the new spiritual leader of New Genesis, Beautiful Dreamer, who would guide the new gods toward her vision of universal equity, while facing dissent from within from factions who see equality as personally disempowering. By shifting the gender balance, we have more sympathetic heroines at the fore, and we have more formidable, yet relatable and developed villains in the fallen former protagonists. While the heavens were realigning, so was the vegan system. In the midst of the Genesian Spring, a new version of the antagonistic Citadel was formed, not just of lame bad guy vegans like Vermin Vundabar clone Harry Hokum, but an assortment of space-based villains of greater magnitude and more recent vintage. Basically, I was doing in the galactic scale what I'd been doing with Conquest of the Barren Earth terrestrially, building towards one ultimate star war, with the Citadel serving as the Empire. That's partly due to DC having so many space-based characters in Who's Who, and partly because the more back issues of Atari Force that I read, the more central that material became in my own grand story scheme.
Let's just go ahead and just let bygones be bygones. I pull up looking like a damn cyborg, weighing 224. Oh man, these boys don't even understand. We think you're special. Dr. Eng, Between the Pages blog, Canoes, Chris at Bad Books for Beginners, Chris Dunford, Dave's Comic Heroes blog, Ed Moore, The Hammer Strikes, Random Geek, E-Stuff, Irredeemable Shag, J. Campbell, JMT Productions, Keith G. Baker, Cressy Mears Ivanovic, Maxa, Richard Field, Ronald Clark, Sam Lowe, Scott X, Siskoid, Superbound, Thirsty's New and Used, Willie Yarbrough, and Ivan Gravina. The preceding program is a non-profit fan production. Any copyrighted materials contained therein are believed borrowed under fair use with no copyright infringement intended. Please feel free to leave comments at Rolled Spines Productions WordPress blog. You can also send us Twitter comments through the Rolled Spine Podcast Twitter. Thank you for listening.